Fort Lincoln, a sprawling military base in the southern United States, was a place of order and discipline. It housed hundreds of soldiers, all bound by the same unyielding rules. But on this cold December morning, order gave way to chaos. Sergeant Sarah Wyatt stood frozen in the middle of the barracks, her trembling hands clutching the smoking M9 pistol. Her olive green uniform was damp with sweat despite the biting winter air. A body lay crumpled on the floor in front of her. Blood pooled beneath the lifeless form of Major Lucas Denton, her commanding officer. The sound of her own ragged breathing filled her ears, mingling with the muffled shouts of soldiers racing to the scene. It was only moments before the heavy metal door burst open and military police swarmed the room. "Drop the weapon!" barked one of the MPs, his rifle trained on her. Sarah obeyed, the gun clattering to the floor. She raised her hands, her face pale but unreadable. "What have you done, Sergeant?" Another voice demanded, this one laced with disbelief. It was Lieutenant Colonel Martin Webb, Denton's immediate superior, who had arrived just seconds after the MPs. He stared at Sarah as if she were a stranger. "Self-defense," Sarah said hoarsely. She faltered, her eyes darting to Denton's body. He wouldn't stop. The MPs hauled her away, her wrists bound tightly behind her back. As they led her out, Sarah cast one last glance at the scene. Denton's face was twisted in a mix of anger and shock, his body forever frozen in time. Sarah Wyatt had always been a fighter. At 32, she was one of the few women to rise through the ranks in a male-dominated force. Her reputation as a skilled strategist and fearless leader had earned her respect among her peers. She was tough, but her beauty, a mix of sharp features and piercing green eyes, often drew unwanted attention. Her marriage to Kyle Wyatt, a civilian contractor, had always been unconventional. They had agreed to an open marriage years ago, believing it would free them from the strain of long-distance deployments. While Kyle occasionally dated other women, Sarah kept her private life discreet. But what she didn't know was that the rules they had set for their marriage would soon unravel in ways she could never have predicted. That morning, Major Denton had called her into his office. Denton, a man in his mid-40s, was a commanding presence on the base. His square jaw and imposing frame made him a natural leader, but his reputation among female officers was murkier. "Sergeant Wyatt, good to see you," he had said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah stood at attention, her posture rigid. "You asked to see me, sir?" "Yes," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've got a special mission coming up, and I think you'd be perfect for it." She frowned. "What kind of mission?" Denton's grin widened. "Let's just say it's an opportunity to work closely with me." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. Sarah forced a neutral expression. "With all due respect, sir, I'd prefer more details before committing to anything." Denton rose from his chair and walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. "You've got guts, Wyatt. I like that." His hand brushed her shoulder, and she tensed. "Permission to leave, sir," she said, her voice icy. Denton ignored her. "You know, I could make your life very easy on this base. Or very hard." When his hand moved to her waist, Sarah stepped back, her fists clenched. "This conversation is over, sir." For a moment, Denton's face darkened, his grin disappearing. But then he nodded, stepping aside. "Dismissed." As Sarah walked out of his office, her heart pounded. She had dealt with men like Denton before, but this felt different. Something about his gaze left her unsettled, as though he had already decided she belonged to him. Sarah was restless as she lay in her bunk that night, her mind replaying the interaction with Denton. She considered reporting him but knew the risks. Speaking out against a superior officer could destroy her career, and without concrete evidence, it would be her word against his. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside her room. A moment later, the door creaked open. "Who's there?" she demanded, sitting up. Denton stepped inside, his face shadowed but unmistakable. "Major, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. He shut the door behind him. "Relax, Wyatt. I just want to talk." "I think you've said enough," she said, reaching for her phone. But before she could grab it, Denton lunged, his hand closing around her wrist. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Sarah struggled, but he was stronger. He pushed her back against the wall, his free hand moving where it didn't belong. It happened in an instant. Her training took over. With a burst of adrenaline, she broke free, grabbing the pistol she kept under her pillow. The sun was just rising over Fort Lincoln when Detective Aaron Cole arrived at the base. A seasoned investigator from the FBI's Military Crimes Unit, Cole was known for his sharp mind and relentless pursuit of the truth. At 47, with salt and pepper hair and a lean, athletic build, he carried an air of authority that made even the most hardened soldiers tread carefully around him. Cole stepped out of his unmarked car and adjusted his trench coat against the chill in the air. He scanned the barracks where soldiers and officers whispered in clusters, their faces tense. Word of Major Lucas Denton's death had spread like wildfire. A young MP approached him. "Detective Cole? Lieutenant Colonel Webb is expecting you in the command center." "Lead the way," Cole replied, his voice calm but firm. The command center was abuzz with activity. Screens displayed security footage, maps of the base, and detailed reports. At the center of it all was Lieutenant Colonel Webb, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and a stern demeanor. "Detective Cole," Webb said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Cole shook his hand. "I understand this is a sensitive case. I'll need full access to the crime scene, witnesses, and any relevant documents." "You'll have everything you need," Webb assured him. "But I have to warn you, this case is already complicated." Cole raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" Webb hesitated. "The suspect, Sergeant Sarah Wyatt, claims it was self-defense. She alleges that Major Denton assaulted her." Cole's expression didn't change, but his mind was already racing. "Is she being held?" "Yes," Webb said. "She's in the detention center. You can speak to her after you've seen the scene." Cole nodded. "Let's start there." The barracks were eerily silent as Cole entered the room where the shooting had occurred. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and MP stood guard outside. The first thing Cole noticed was the blood. Two distinct pools stained the floor, suggesting the shots had been fired at close range. Major Denton's body had already been removed, but chalk outlines marked his position. "Where was Wyatt standing when she fired?" Cole asked the forensic officer on site. "Here," the officer said, pointing to a spot near the bed. "She claimed Denton entered her room without permission and tried to assault her. She retrieved her weapon from under her pillow and fired twice." Cole examined the room carefully. The bed was unmade and a lamp lay shattered on the floor, as though knocked over during a struggle. On the desk was an open notebook, filled with notes written in neat, precise handwriting. He turned to the forensic officer. "Any signs of forced entry?" "None, but Denton's fingerprints are on the doorknob." Cole frowned. "So he let himself in?" The officer nodded. "That's correct. And according to Wyatt's initial statement, she warned him to leave before she fired." Cole's eyes narrowed as he inspected the scene. Something didn't add up. "What about the angle of the shots?" The officer gestured to a diagram. "The first shot hit Denton in the chest at close range. The second struck his shoulder as he fell." Cole studied the diagram. "Were there any witnesses?" "None in the immediate area," the officer replied. "But several soldiers heard the gunshots and arrived moments later." Cole made a mental note to interview them. He glanced around the room one last time, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Sergeant Sarah Wyatt sat alone in a small interrogation room, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked tired but composed, her green eyes steady as Cole entered. "Sergeant Wyatt," Cole said, taking a seat across from her. "I'm Detective Aaron Cole. I'm here to get to the truth." She gave a curt nod. "I've already told them what happened. I'm not them," Cole said, his tone even. "Start from the beginning. Take your time." Sarah hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It started yesterday morning. Denton called me into his office. He made inappropriate comments, suggested I should spend time with him to get ahead. I told him I wasn't interested and left." Cole nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Last night, I was in my room when he came in. He didn't knock. He just walked in. I told him to leave, but he wouldn't. He grabbed me." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. "I tried to push him off, but he was too strong. I reached for my gun and told him to back off. He laughed at me, said I wouldn't do it. I fired." Cole studied her carefully. "Why did you fire twice?" "The first shot hit him, but he didn't go down. He came toward me again, so I fired a second time." Her hands clenched in her lap as she spoke, her knuckles white. "Do you have any history with Major Denton?" Cole asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not beyond the occasional interaction at work. He outranked me. I kept my distance." Cole leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Is there anyone who can corroborate your story? Anyone who knew about the harassment?" Sarah hesitated. "I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid it would damage my career." Cole nodded, jotting down notes. "One last question for now. Did you and Denton have any kind of personal relationship outside of work?" "No," Sarah said firmly. Cole closed his notebook. "Thank you, Sergeant. We'll talk again soon." As Cole reviewed the evidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Denton's history on the base was spotless. No official complaints, no disciplinary actions. But Sarah's account painted a very different picture. He turned to Lieutenant Colonel Webb. "I need access to Denton's personal records, including any unofficial complaints or rumors about him." Webb looked uneasy. "Denton was a respected officer. Are you sure that's necessary?" "I'm sure," Cole said. "If there's even a hint of misconduct in his past, I need to know about it." Webb sighed. "I'll see what I can find." As Cole prepared to dig deeper, he knew one thing for certain. This case was far from simple. Detective Aaron Cole didn't waste time. He requested Denton's personal files and began reviewing them in a small, quiet office within the command center. The reports were immaculate. Too immaculate. For a man of Denton's rank and years of service, Cole expected to see at least minor disciplinary notes or complaints. But there was nothing. Just glowing commendations and spotless performance reviews. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "No one's perfect," he muttered to himself. Determined to dig deeper, Cole contacted his office for additional background checks. Within hours, the FBI's database delivered a few whispers. Denton's previous station had multiple instances of informal complaints. Nothing filed officially, but rumors of inappropriate behavior toward female officers. Most were dismissed without investigation. Cole picked up his phone and called Detective Clara Ortiz, an old colleague stationed at Denton's former base in Texas. "Clara," Cole began, "I need some information about a Major Lucas Denton. He served at Fort Bryer 2 years ago." Ortiz's voice was sharp, as always. "Denton? That name rings a bell. What's going on?" "He was shot and killed at Fort Lincoln. There's an allegation of sexual assault, but I'm finding his record unusually clean. Any chance you've heard something?" There was a pause on the line before Ortiz spoke again, her tone cautious. "I remember some murmurs about Denton, but nothing ever stuck. A couple of junior officers hinted at inappropriate comments, but no one ever filed a report. Either they were scared or someone buried it." Cole frowned. "Do you know who might have handled those complaints?" "Captain Bill Lacey. He's retired now, but still lives near Fort Bryer. He might know more." "Thanks, Clara. I'll reach out to him." Before following up on Denton's past, Cole turned his attention to the soldiers who had arrived on the scene after the shooting. He interviewed them one by one in the interrogation room. Private First Class Jason Hill was the first to speak. A young man in his early 20s, Hill looked nervous as he sat across from Cole. "You were one of the first on the scene," Cole began. "Tell me what you saw." Hill nodded quickly. "I heard the shots and ran towards Sergeant Wyatt's room. When I got there, she was standing by the bed holding her gun. Denton was on the floor bleeding." "Did she say anything?" "Yeah," Hill said, his voice trembling slightly. "She kept saying he wouldn't stop. He wouldn't stop." She looked terrified. Cole made a note of this. "Did you notice anything unusual about her demeanor? Did she seem angry? Calm? She seemed shaken, like she didn't believe what had just happened." Cole nodded and dismissed Hill. Next was Corporal Monica Reeves, a no-nonsense woman in her late 20s. Reeves spoke with confidence, but her brow furrowed as she recalled the events. "I was in the hallway when I heard the gunshots," Reeves said. "I ran to Wyatt's room and saw her standing there with the gun. She looked pale, like she was in shock." "Did she say anything to you?" Cole asked. "She kept repeating that she warned him, that she told him to stop." "I believed her." Cole leaned forward slightly. "Why?" Reeves hesitated, then sighed. "Because Denton had a reputation. Nothing official, but everyone knew he liked to push boundaries with female soldiers. Most of us just avoided him. Cole's pen froze mid-note. Did Wyatt ever mention feeling uncomfortable around Denton? Reeves shook her head. Not to me, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Armed with new insights, Cole returned to Webb. Did you know Denton had informal complaints against him at Fort Bryer? Cole asked, watching Webb's reaction closely. Webb's face darkened. No, I didn't. That information should have been in his file. Someone covered it up, Cole said. I've got a lead on a retired captain who might know more. I'll need time to track him down. Webb nodded reluctantly. Do what you need to do, but this case is causing a lot of tension on base. I need answers soon. Cole drove 2 hours to a quiet suburban neighborhood near Fort Bryer. Captain Bill Lacey's home was a modest single-story house with a well-kept lawn. Lacey answered the door, a tall man in his 60s with sharp blue eyes that hadn't lost their edge. Detective Cole, he said, shaking Cole's hand. Come in. The two men sat in Lacey's living room, a neat space adorned with photos of his military career. What can I do for you, Detective? Lacey asked. I'm investigating Major Lucas Denton. He was killed last night at Fort Lincoln. The circumstances involve an allegation of sexual assault. I've uncovered some rumors about his behavior at Fort Bryer. Can you shed any light on that? Lacey's expression hardened. I'm not surprised. Denton was a liability. There were complaints, quiet ones, but nothing ever made it up the chain of command. Why not? Because Denton had friends in high places, Lacey said bitterly. Anytime someone tried to report him, it got swept under the rug. They said he was too valuable to lose. Cole's jaw tightened. Do you remember any specific incidents? Lacey nodded. There was a young lieutenant who accused him of harassment. She wanted to file a formal complaint, but her superiors convinced her to drop it. They told her it would ruin her career. Do you know her name? Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes. She left the military shortly after. Cole jotted the name down. Thank you, Captain. You've been very helpful. As Cole drove back to the base, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was uncovering a much larger pattern. Denton's power and connections had shielded him for years, but it seemed his past had finally caught up with him. When he returned, Cole called his office to locate Rebecca Hayes. If she was willing to talk, her testimony could be the key to understanding the full scope of Denton's actions. But there was still one question lingering in Cole's mind. Was Sarah Wyatt telling the whole truth? The investigation was starting to feel like a labyrinth. With each twist and turn, Cole uncovered more hidden corners, more dark secrets that had been buried for too long. His gut told him Sarah Wyatt wasn't just a victim. She had more to her story than she was letting on. But he couldn't ignore the signs that pointed to Denton's history of abuse. Was it all connected? Or was there more to this than simple misconduct? The phone rang sharply, pulling Cole from his thoughts. He was sitting at his desk in the command center, reviewing the files on Sarah Wyatt when the call came through. Detective Cole? The voice on the other end was soft but steady. This is Rebecca Hayes. I hear you're looking for me. Yes, Lieutenant Hayes, thank you for calling back. I'm investigating the death of Major Lucas Denton. I understand you worked with him at Fort Bryer. I need to ask you about what happened there. There was a long pause before Hayes spoke again, her voice now laced with hesitation. I've tried to forget him, but I guess I can't anymore. Anything you can share might help me understand what went wrong. Cole spoke gently, trying to ease the tension. I was a second lieutenant when I met Denton. He was already a major by then, but he had a way with people. He was always charming, always above it all. At first I thought he was just being friendly, but things changed quickly. Hayes paused again, as though gathering the courage to continue. He started making comments. At first it was subtle, a compliment here, a comment there, but then he pushed further. He invited me to his office late at night to discuss career advancement. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I got there, he was different. He locked the door behind me and started talking about how much potential I had, how I could go far if I played my cards right. Cole leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. What happened next? I tried to leave, but he stopped me. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the room. He said if I didn't stay, he'd make sure my career was over before it started. Hayes's voice faltered. He tried to kiss me. I pushed him off and ran. I didn't know what to do after that. I felt trapped. Cole's heart sank. Did you report him? Hayes let out a bitter laugh. You don't understand how it works, detective. A lieutenant doesn't report a major, especially not one with connections like Denton. I was new and I knew no one would believe me, so I kept quiet. I transferred out as soon as I could. But I heard rumors of him doing the same thing to other women after me. Cole scribbled the details down quickly. You were right to leave. Thank you for telling me this, Lieutenant. I know it wasn't easy. After a long pause, Hayes added, be careful with Wyatt. She might have been a victim, but there's more to her than you think. Why do you say that? Cole asked, his curiosity piqued. I don't know for sure, but when Denton came after me, Wyatt was the one who helped cover up some of the rumors. She's more involved than she's letting on. The words echoed in Cole's mind. Had Sarah Wyatt been protecting Denton all along? Or was there something more sinister at play? Cole's next move was clear. He needed to confront Sarah Wyatt again. Her version of events had been too neat, too perfect. There had to be more, something she wasn't telling him. When he arrived at her quarters, Wyatt was sitting on her bed, her posture stiff, eyes wide. She seemed ready for a confrontation. Sergeant Wyatt, Cole began, I've spoken to some of your colleagues and learned more about Denton's past. I need you to tell me everything. Did he ever make you feel uncomfortable before that night? Wyatt looked at him, her expression unreadable. She hesitated before speaking, her voice tight. I told you everything, Detective. Denton, he came into my room, tried to touch me. I told him to stop, but he didn't listen. So I shot him. I had to. Cole nodded slowly, but he wasn't convinced. What happened after the incident? Why didn't you immediately report it? Wyatt flinched. She took a deep breath. I didn't know what to do. I didn't trust anyone. He was so powerful. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Did you ever feel like you were in danger before that night? Did Denton threaten you in any way? Wyatt hesitated again, her eyes darting around the room. He didn't threaten me exactly, but I heard things, rumors about him and other women. I thought maybe it was just talk, but it was hard to ignore. Cole's instincts were screaming. Something wasn't adding up. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. You're holding back, Sarah. What aren't you telling me? She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. I didn't want to get anyone else involved. I thought if I just shot him, it would all be over. But now, I'm just scared. Cole stood up, his mind racing. He had heard enough. There was a deeper layer to this case, one that involved not just Denton's past actions, but Sarah Wyatt's involvement in it. The question now was whether she was a victim or something else entirely. As Cole walked out of the room, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his office. Forensic team found something. They need you to come in. His heart skipped a beat. He was getting closer to the truth. At the forensic lab, Cole met with Dr. Peter Wright, the lead forensic analyst. Detective, you're going to want to see this, Dr. Wright said, holding up a small envelope. We found traces of DNA on the sleeve of Sarah Wyatt's jacket. Is it Denton's? Cole asked, already knowing the answer. Dr. Wright nodded gravely. Yes, but there's more. We also found traces of a different DNA, a male's underneath Wyatt's fingernails. Cole's stomach churned. This was the break he'd been waiting for, but it didn't answer all the questions. The more he uncovered, the more complicated the situation became. The evidence was starting to mount. Each piece, each thread uncovered, was slowly piecing together a picture Cole wasn't sure he wanted to see. The DNA evidence had added a new layer to the case, suggesting that Sarah Wyatt wasn't just a victim of Denton's harassment. There was something more, something dark and dangerous that she wasn't revealing. But what? Why had she lied? Was she trying to protect herself? Or was there a more sinister reason behind her silence? The next morning, Cole had a meeting with Sarah Wyatt. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He entered her quarters again, determined not to let her off the hook this time. Wyatt, Cole began, his voice calm but forceful. We found DNA evidence under your nails. It's not Denton's. It's another man's. I need to know who he is. Wyatt froze at the mention of the new DNA evidence. She had been expecting this moment, but hadn't prepared for it. Her face turned pale and she quickly averted her gaze. I, I didn't want to involve anyone else, she stammered, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Cole sat down in front of her, his gaze fixed and unrelenting. Who was he, Sarah? Was he with you that night? Wyatt swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. It's not what you think. It wasn't like that. He wasn't part of it. Who was he then? Cole pressed. Wyatt hesitated, looking down at her hands as if trying to gather the strength to speak. It was David. David Walker. David Walker? Cole repeated. Who is he? How is he connected to this? Sarah took a deep breath, visibly fighting against the weight of the truth. David was a soldier under Denton's command. He and we were close. More than close. We were together. Cole's brow furrowed. And how does this fit into everything? Why didn't you tell me this before? Because, Wyatt's voice cracked, I didn't want anyone to know. David and I had a secret relationship. It wasn't just about the physical side. It was about control, about power. Denton knew about us. He didn't like it. He wanted me for himself. He wanted to break us apart. And when he couldn't, he started threatening David. Cole could see where this was going. Denton threatened David? Was that why you shot him? Wyatt nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, Denton knew about David and me. He tried to blackmail me, tried to make me choose between my career and David. I couldn't lose him, not after everything we'd been through. I had to protect him. So when Denton came to my room that night, You shot him, Cole finished for her, his voice cold. Wyatt nodded again, barely able to look at him. I shot him to protect David, but it wasn't supposed to end like this. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could bury the truth and move on. Cole leaned back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. Everything was beginning to fall into place, but the pieces didn't sit easily with him. Sarah Wyatt had been hiding a secret life, one that involved a forbidden relationship with a fellow soldier. She had shot Denton not out of self-defense, but to protect a lover she had kept hidden, someone who had been in danger because of Denton's obsession with her. As Cole left Sarah Wyatt's quarters, his mind raced. What else had Denton been hiding? How many lives had he ruined in the name of power and control? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Denton wasn't just a man who preyed on vulnerable women. He had wielded his influence to destroy people's careers, manipulate soldiers, and abuse his authority. Cole went back to the files, digging deeper into Denton's military history. What he found left him speechless. There had been numerous complaints about Denton over the years: sexual harassment charges, assault allegations, and accusations of abuse of power. But nothing had ever stuck. Denton was too well connected, too respected, and too dangerous. His victims had been silenced, their careers ruined if they tried to stand up to him. But Sarah Wyatt had done the one thing no one else had. She had fought back. Yet even in the face of all this, something about Wyatt's story didn't sit right. She had told him she shot Denton to protect David Walker, but Cole couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. To get to the bottom of this, Cole needed to find David Walker. He wasn't sure where to start, but a quick search led him to a nearby military base. David had been transferred shortly after Denton's death, but Cole knew he had to talk to him. When he arrived at the base, David was just finishing up a physical training session. He was tall, muscular, with short cropped hair and a hardened expression. The moment he saw Cole approach, his eyes narrowed and he tensed. "Detective," David greeted him with a flat tone, his arms crossed over his chest. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you about Denton," Cole began, his voice steady but commanding. "And Sarah Wyatt." David's eyes darkened at the mention of Sarah's name. "What about them?" "I've heard about your relationship with Sarah. I know about your connection to Denton's death." David stepped back, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't know anything." Cole didn't flinch. "I know enough. Denton was blackmailing you and Sarah. He was trying to use you both. But things got out of hand, didn't they?" David's face contorted with anger, but there was a flicker of fear behind his eyes. "What's your point, detective?" "Sarah shot Denton because she was trying to protect you." But there's more to it, isn't there? You were in a position to help her, but you didn't. You could have stopped him. David looked away, his jaw tight. I didn't know what to do. He was powerful. He could have ruined me, ruined everything I'd worked for. I thought I could handle it. I didn't expect her to do what she did. Cole's heart pounded in his chest. And now she's paying the price? Sarah's in prison and you're free. But you both had a part in this. You knew about Denton's behavior, and you did nothing. David's silence spoke volumes. He knew the truth, but he wasn't ready to admit it. As Cole left David's base, a sense of finality began to settle in. The case wasn't solved yet, but it was closer than ever. He had uncovered the web of lies and secrets, the hidden relationships, and the dark side of Denton's reign of terror. But even now, Cole had more questions than answers. Was Sarah Wyatt a hero who had acted in self-defense, or was she complicit in a larger conspiracy? How many other soldiers had been affected by Denton's cruelty, and what had they done to survive it? And most importantly, had the truth truly come out, or were there still hidden layers waiting to be uncovered? The air was heavy with tension as Cole returned to Sarah Wyatt's quarters. He had all but solved the case, but something gnawed at him. Despite everything he had uncovered, there was still one more piece missing. His instincts told him that Sarah wasn't being entirely truthful. The story didn't add up, and he needed her to come clean, completely. As he entered the room, Sarah was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. The weight of everything was starting to show. Her eyes were red from hours of crying, but she didn't seem surprised to see him. "Detective," she said softly, looking up at him. "I knew you'd be back. I know I haven't been honest, but I didn't think I could face the truth. Not until now." Cole didn't waste any time. He'd had enough of half-truths. "I know about David, Sarah. I know what you were trying to protect, but there's something you haven't told me yet, and I need to hear it now." Sarah's gaze faltered, and she clenched her fists in her lap, as if preparing herself for something monumental. "You're right," she whispered. "There's more to it. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this, but I realize now that I can't keep lying." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "David Walker wasn't the only reason I shot Denton. He wasn't the only one in danger." Cole felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean? Who else?" Sarah's eyes met his with a raw, pained honesty. "It was me, detective. Denton was going to kill me. Slowly. He had been for months. He wasn't just threatening David, he was threatening me too." Cole's confusion deepened. "Threatening you how? Do you remember the reports? The ones about Denton's harassment? Well, they weren't just about his obsession with me. They were about his manipulation, his control. It wasn't just sexual. Denton was trying to break me down mentally. He wanted me to be his, to be completely under his control. And when I resisted, he started punishing me." Cole was stunned. This wasn't the story he had been prepared for. "So you shot him because he was going to kill you?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "But not just that. It wasn't a matter of self-defense in that moment. It was self-preservation. Denton had orchestrated everything. He had put everything in motion, from my relationship with David to the constant threats. He had planned to destroy me, and I realized that if I didn't act, I would be lost. My career, my life, everything would have been his to take." Sarah paused, her breath hitching as she relived the events. "I had been trying to get away from him for so long. I kept reporting him to higher-ups, but nothing changed. He was too powerful, too dangerous. And when David and I were discovered, it was the final straw. Denton lost control. He came to my room that night, and I knew if I didn't stop him, I would never get another chance." Cole felt the weight of Sarah's words settle over him like a fog. Her story, which had once seemed like an act of revenge, was now framed in an entirely new light. Denton hadn't been some mere abuser. He had been a predator, and Sarah Wyatt had been his prey. But there was more. The twist Cole hadn't expected was the final revelation Sarah made. "I wasn't the only one he did this to," Sarah said quietly, her voice breaking. "There were others. Soldiers who had been too afraid to speak out. I was just the first to fight back, the first to get caught in the crossfire." "What do you mean?" Cole asked, his voice laced with disbelief. You're saying Denton had other victims? Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. He used his position to control them, to break them, and when they couldn't take it anymore, he discarded them like they were nothing. Some of them didn't survive. Others were too broken to keep fighting. Cole was silent for a moment, digesting the gravity of what Sarah had just revealed. Denton had been more than a man with a dark obsession. He had been a ruthless, calculated predator who used his power to destroy lives. Sarah's shoulders sagged as she wiped her eyes. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I had no choice. He wasn't just a threat to me, he was a threat to everyone around him, and I had to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. As Sarah finished speaking, Cole's mind raced. What Sarah had just told him shifted the entire case. Denton hadn't just been a man with a vendetta against a woman. He had been a serial abuser, using his rank and power to victimize countless soldiers, including Sarah Wyatt. He had manipulated, blackmailed, and destroyed those who dared to stand against him. Sarah had been his first, and she had paid the price for it. Cole looked at Sarah with new eyes. She wasn't just a soldier who had committed murder in the heat of the moment. She was a woman who had fought for her life, a woman who had been pushed to the brink by a man too powerful to be stopped. Sarah Wyatt had been forced into a corner, with no way out but to act. And in doing so, she had taken a life to protect her own. I believe you, Sarah, Cole said quietly, his voice tinged with sympathy. You were a victim too, but you need to face the consequences of your actions. Sarah nodded, knowing that she couldn't escape the truth anymore. I understand, she whispered. With this final piece of the puzzle in place, Cole knew what he had to do. The investigation was far from over, but the truth was clear. Denton had been a predator, and Sarah Wyatt had been his first victim to stand up to him. But Cole also knew that Sarah's actions, while driven by self-defense, would not go unpunished. The law had its own sense of justice, one that couldn't be ignored. But perhaps in the grand scheme of things, there was a greater truth. Sometimes the law failed to protect those it was supposed to, and sometimes justice had to be fought for, even at the cost of taking a life. The courtroom was filled with the usual tension that accompanied a high-profile case. Outside, a crowd of reporters stood eagerly waiting for updates, their cameras flashing as they hoped for a glimpse of the truth. Inside, however, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. It was the final day of the trial, and everyone knew this would be the moment that decided Sarah Wyatt's fate. Would the truth about Denton's reign of terror be enough to save her, or would the law demand its pound of flesh, regardless of the circumstances? Cole sat in the back of the courtroom, his arms folded across his chest. His role in the case had ended. His investigation had uncovered the truth, but it was up to the jury now. He could only hope that they would understand what he had come to realize, that Sarah was not a murderer, but a woman who had been pushed to the edge by a dangerous predator. Sarah sat at the defense table, her eyes tired but resolute. She was no longer the broken woman who had first confessed to Cole. She had spent the last several weeks in prison, but something had shifted in her during that time. She had come to terms with what she had done, but she had also accepted that she couldn't change the past. The question now was what would happen next. The prosecutor, a man named Vincent Harris, was a seasoned lawyer who had built a reputation for winning tough cases. He was methodical and unyielding, and he had a clear agenda: to hold Sarah Wyatt accountable for the death of her commanding officer, Colonel Denton. As he stood before the jury, he painted a picture of a woman who had acted out of vengeance, a woman who had been in a position of power and abused it to settle personal scores. He reminded the jury of Sarah's military training and the cold, calculated nature of her actions. Sergeant Sarah Wyatt shot Colonel Denton twice in cold blood, Harris said, his voice echoing in the courtroom. She had no right to take matters into her own hands, no matter how much she may have been suffering. The law is clear. Murder is murder. There are no exceptions, no excuses. He turned toward Sarah, his gaze hardening. She chose to take his life, and for that, she must be held responsible. Sarah's defense attorney, a woman named Laura Hayes, had a different view of the situation. She was calm and composed as she stood to address the jury. She was aware that this was a tough case, but she believed in Sarah's innocence. Not in the legal sense, perhaps, but in the moral sense. Yes, Sergeant Wyatt shot Colonel Denton, Laura began, her voice steady. But what the prosecution fails to mention is why. Why did she do it? What drove her to make that decision? She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Sarah Wyatt was a victim. She was a victim of a man who abused his position, who used his power to destroy her and countless others. Colonel Denton wasn't a hero. He was a predator who had been manipulating and controlling Sarah for months, if not years. She tried to report him, to get justice, but nothing changed. Every attempt she made to stop him was met with silence. Laura's voice rose, her passion evident. And so she did what any person would do when pushed to the edge. She fought back, not out of vengeance, but out of survival. She shot him because she had no other choice. She shot him because he was going to kill her next. She turned to the jury, her eyes meeting theirs with a plea for understanding. Sarah Wyatt is not a murderer. She is a hero who stood up against an abusive system, a system that failed her time and time again. We ask that you consider not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice. What was done to her was wrong. What she did was an act of self-preservation. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Cole sat in the back, watching Sarah's every movement. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he could also see the strength she had developed over the course of this trial. She had faced her worst nightmare, and she was still standing. Hours passed, and the courtroom remained silent except for the rustling of papers and the occasional murmur between the attorneys. Cole knew that the jury had a tough decision ahead of them. They had to decide whether Sarah's actions had been those of a woman fighting for her life, or whether they had been those of a woman driven by vengeance. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. The judge, a middle-aged man named Judge Harrison, called the proceedings to order. "Will the jury please rise?" Judge Harrison said, his voice solemn. The jury foreman, a woman in her 50s, stood up and walked to the bench. She looked at the judge and then at Sarah, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and empathy. "Your Honor," the foreman began, her voice steady, "we, the jury, have reached a verdict in the case of the people versus Sergeant Sarah Wyatt. We find the defendant not guilty." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom as the words were spoken. Sarah's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears, and she let out a shaky breath as she collapsed back into her chair. It was over. The nightmare had ended. Cole felt a strange sense of relief wash over him as well. He had known Sarah wasn't guilty in the way the law had accused her, but hearing the words from the jury made it real. Sarah Wyatt, the woman who had been pushed to the brink and forced to make an impossible decision, was free. Sarah Wyatt walked out of the courtroom a free woman, but she knew that her life would never be the same. The events of the past few months had left scars on her, both physical and emotional. She had faced a predator, and in doing so, she had become a victim in a different sense. But now at least, she could begin to heal. For Cole, the case was over, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever. He had seen the fragility of the human spirit, the way people could be driven to extremes when they were cornered, and the lengths they would go to when they had nothing left to lose. Sarah Wyatt wasn't just a soldier, she was a survivor. And for that, she deserved something the law had failed to give her: peace. As Sarah walked into the sunlight, a new chapter of her life awaited. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready. And for the first time in a long time, she could breathe freely, knowing she had finally won the battle for her own survival.